Hello everyone, welcome to this video that is entitled The Intolerable King. It's the fourth video in our first unit here, and we're going to be talking about how the ideas of John Locke, which influenced the colonists, sort of get them in trouble with the King of England. So the king clamps down, the colonists fight back, and there is the very creepy looking Burger King king. Okay, so here's what's going on in the American colonies. Right before the Revolution. You guys know, you studied this time period back in 5th grade, for about 150 years, England was in charge of the American colonies. But, even though they were in charge of them, they really didn't get involved much. They were far away from each other, and colonists lived with freedom for a long time. That changed in the 1750s. In 1754, England went to war with France, and part of this war took place in the American colonies, actually like out west by the Appalachian Mountains. It was called the French and Indian War. So colonists who were part of England obviously helped England fight France. So because this war was taking place in the colonies, England sent soldiers to fight this war. And once the war was over, the soldiers were in America, and many of them stayed, and the king just kept the soldiers there. And that's when things started to go bad, because now the king had his army in the colonies, and the king was very much more involved in the way colonists lived. So the colonists had all this freedom from the king. There was a war, and all of a sudden, no freedom anymore. The king thought the colonists should share the cost of paying the war, like all the English citizens had to do. However, the colonists obviously disagreed with that. Okay, so here is a very blurry picture. You have in 1754, here is this purple part here is the American colonies. In 1763, this is the all of England. So you see England went from just a little strip here to gaining lots of land because they beat France in the French and Indian War. Okay, so the first thing that happened is that American colonists, they want to go from this dark pink section, which is where their land was before the war, and they want to start moving out this way into this light pink section that they gained in territory from France. However, England forbid this movement with a law called the Proclamation of 1763. They didn't want colonists moving into this land and having conflicts with Native Americans. They wanted to have peace for a little while. So England said no movement past this line. This, the American colonists thought, violated a lot of their freedoms they thought that John Locke's ideas had given them, and they got very upset. And many of them protested and even disobeyed England and went out west anyway. A little closer look at the map here. Another thing that you may have studied was the Sugar Act. So, like I said, the king thought the colony should help pay in the cost of the French and Indian War. So the king put a tax on sugar and other products. The law also limited trade and only let certain things go to England, which made people very, very upset. And in 1764, people started to protest this law, and they had little cartoon pictures like this one in the paper where they made fun of the king and mocked his taxes. Okay, things continued to get worse in 1765. The king put another new tax on, again to help pay for the war that the king thought the colonists should help pay, but the colonists disagreed. And this time it required colonists to pay tax on all paper products. That's why it was called the Stamp Act, including stamps. And then you would have you'd have to have a stamp on your paper product to show that you've paid the tax. So ships papers, legal documents, licenses, newspapers, you can think of all sorts of paper products would have been taxed. This law angered colonists because they had no input. The king was putting these taxes on people without the colonists having any say in the government, which again John Locke believed was wrong. Another law, and this is just a few of many laws the king put in place, was called the Quartering Act. The king thought that because all the troops were in America now after the French and Indian War, they needed a place to stay. So the king passed this thing called the Quartering Act, which required people to house soldiers in their homes against their will. So the Quartering Act here required colonists to house and feed soldiers in their own homes if asked. And I don't have to explain this very much. You can probably imagine why this law made colonists mad. Of course, it was more English controlling their lives, but imagine a dirty, smelly army soldier living with you and eating all your food. That would not be good. Okay, and then the most famous one that you've probably all remember studying back in elementary school, the Tea Act. England had a tea company that had lots of extra tea. They needed a place to sell it, so England allowed the company to sell tea at a wicked cheap rate in America, like dirt cheap. So no one would buy anybody else's tea. They'd always buy this English tea. English merchants who imported tea would be out of business, or American merchants, as we say. Thus, they protested, and of course, they dumped all the tea into the Charles River in Boston, in the Boston Tea Party, in that famous act by the Sons of Liberty. Okay, so the last one we'll talk about, the most severe, is the Intolerable Acts. This is the final straw. It was issued in response to the Boston Tea Party. It did lots of things. It closed down Boston Harbor. It shut down local government. It made you go on trial for a crime. You'd actually have to go on trial to England and not have the trial take place in Boston or the colonies. And they renewed the Quartering Act in Boston. This was a punishment. It was not to raise money. It was not to help raise soldiers. This act was clearly, you guys dumped all my tea in the river, we're going to punish you. So things had gotten so bad in the colonies that the king was actually now making laws just for punishment. So to conclude, the French and Indian War caused the king to pay attention to the colonies for the first time in many years. The colonists didn't like that. They weren't used to having the king involved in their lives. The king then started to pass new laws to raise revenue to pay for the war, and the colonies didn't like that either. Eventually, the king even passed laws as a punishment for protests. The colonists resented these laws. They thought they were awful, that they went against their freedom. The colonists believed in the ideas of John Locke, that they had certain natural rights that the government should be protecting, and the king did not. So there was a clear disagreement between the two sides. And the Intolerable Acts were the last straw. It was clear that the relationship between the colonies and king was well beyond repair, and very soon after the Intolerable Acts, both sides prepared and went to war in the Revolutionary War.